So I've been, being director of Barcelona GSE doesn't give me a lot of time for doing research, but I still keep some work going. And what I wanted to tell you is about some very applied research that I've done recently. We are still under revision on a paper, which unfortunately is with 3 co-authors, and one of them, who you'll see, died recently, so we are struggling the other 2. I mean, he was very old and recognized, you'll see that. But anyway, so I put together, so I'm gonna present that, which is about decentralization, but given that I don't think you're very familiar with what's behind the focus of decentralization, I don't think there is much of a topic in our programs. I'm just gonna try to give you a few outlines about it. So essentially I want to talk about fiscal decentralization and diversity, because then I'm gonna focus on the US as a case of diversity in fiscal decentralization, and then I'm gonna just mention a few things from lessons that Europe could learn. So essentially, why should we care about fiscal decentralization and what's good about it? And essentially, that's why I talked about diversity. What makes potential efficiency of fiscal decentralization is that there is diversity in the different territorial units of a country. So then you can have welfare improvements. Yeah, now it's working? Thank you. So you could have welfare improvements with doing a better performance of the public sector when some of the things you provide at the local level, okay? So diverse preferences across the territories are kind of one of the main bases for arguing that fiscal decentralization may improve the outcome versus centralization of a country, okay? So Oates' decentralization theorem is very, very old, and things have evolved quite a lot, but still very valid, because that's the basis of the goodness of the decentralization. Of course, there are some caveats on it, but essentially the decentralization theorem, let me kind of go through it, because that will give as a basis, and then we'll go on. It says, for a public good, the consumption of which is defined over geographical areas, so that's essential, for which the cost of providing each level of output in each jurisdiction is about the same as at central, so we cannot explode economies of scale. It will always be more efficient, or at least as efficient, for local governments to provide the very efficient levels of output than for a central government to do that. And that is based on, because a uniform level of output will not fit so well the preferences that are diverse across the geographic areas. Okay, so that's essentially the basis. Now, what are the magnitudes of the welfare gains that you can gain with decentralization? Of course, a heterogeneity of demand. The higher is the heterogeneity of demand, the more you can gain by doing different things to the different territories according to the different preferences. And differences in costs across jurisdiction may also enhance the efficiency. Some other, you can gain efficiency from competition across units. So this goes beyond, sometimes you talk about, should we have a uniform tax system across different regions, or should we let the regions to do it their own way? Well, in principle, if you allow competition across regions, then you would be better off. Of course, that competition has to be on equal terms. Everybody can't be competitive. Otherwise, if one can be and others not, then it is a problem, right? Which is maybe what's going on in some countries like our country. So that's why we take the US system. You'll see how different the US system is. Innovation experimentation, for example, it is historically true that the states in the US have been laboratories for trying things out, and then other states have followed. So doing it in one region or another region, and then others follow, in maybe a small region or some region that is willing to do something different, they will see how it works, and then they may be able to follow up. And more accountability can be managed at the decentralized level. Sometimes also there are problems though in there because of the communities are very close and small, and then there is maybe place for too much corruption as well. There are limits to decentralization because if we have positive geographic spillovers, then we may lose by doing decentralization without thinking, without internalizing those externalities. Of course, if there are economies of scale, then that service we should provide it centrally. One typical example is military provision or defense, right? Defense is, the larger is the area of defense that you cover, the more efficient it is. So it doesn't make sense for Catalonia to have its own military group, although we have police, but that's a very different thing, but not defense in the terms of military. And then equity policies, well, we have to be careful about the equity policies because of the mobility, right? So if one region provides better welfare and equity policies than another, then if there is mobility, there'll be a huge move towards that region that provides better welfare policies, and then that region may not be able to eventually finance those policies because they will have too many people to be covered and too little people to be with resources to pay. So there are also well-defined issues about the macro stabilization policies. Some national governments don't have the means to do those macro policies, so in principle, economically the best is to do it at the central level. And income redistribution in assistance to the poor, as I said before, because of mobility, and the economies of scale. So these then, from the point of view of efficiency, should be at the central government. Now, this is just the starting, and then I'll go very fast because otherwise Ada will not have time for her talk. But I thought I needed to give you some basic issues just to see that when there is diversity, how important it is. So if there is diversity in preferences, how important it is to provide diversity in the provision of public goods, because that's the efficient way. And what we've done in this paper is really just to show systematically how diverse the US system is. Actually, first time I analyzed the US system, and when you talk with other Europeans sometimes, people I don't think are aware of how diverse the different US states are. If you live there, you see it, but if you haven't been there, you think, oh no, well, this US fiscal federalism is it's just like our communities here, our autonomous communities here, or something like in Italy or whatever. Well, let's see it, okay? So in this paper, we actually try to see several issues. The first thing is that we try to talk about what's the US brand of fiscal federalism. And essentially, this is the introduction. We want to show how distinct the fiscal system is in the US, in this decentralized model, and how diverse it is. So let me go through, because I already talked about that. So we're going to focus on several variables, and for aim of speed, I'm going to jump. So let's see the first one. First, we're going to do some international comparison. So first, we try to say, well, the US is relatively small in terms of the size of the government, but it's highly decentralized. Okay, that's the main thing internationally, and then we get through in detail with the US. So the size of the government, you can see, do I have a pointer here? Yes. So here, the paper is focused on the US, so that's why we highlight that, but it is on the lower bound of the percentage. This is the size of the government from OECD, and this is total expenditures as percentage of GDP and total revenues. Notice that there are differences between expenditures and revenues. We have ordered the countries by expenditures, and this is the 2013. Actually, we had initially graphs from 2010 or 11, and the differences were even larger because this is the recession period. This is getting, the countries are recovering, but in the recession time, the difference between expenditures and revenues were larger because countries were, in debt, higher, even indebting much more than now. And it's interesting to see, well, first let me point out that the United States is on the lower part of the distribution. France here, I don't know if this is going to change with Macron, but at this point is very high in the size of government on the economy. 60% of the economy is managed by the public sector. It's huge. In the US is about 33, 39, right? Okay. Now, the other thing I want to point out in this graph is Norway. Look at Norway. The revenues are much higher than the expenditures. We all know that Norway is a country that has so much saving, and it's present in all these investment groups and having parts of companies all over the world. Well, they do have a surplus in their budget, and it's accumulating, and we see it here, just 1 year, but this is every year. So it highlights as a very interesting case. Anyway, let me move on. Degree of decentralization, because we're trying to focus on that. And here, what we measure is the state and local revenues over central, state, and local. All right, we take, so talking about Spain or other kind, like in Spain, it would be regions and municipalities here, okay? Now, notice that we have ordered the countries by the revenues. Because we think that the real measure of decentralization power is that the subnational governments do have their decisions on revenues. And then notice, so this is how it goes, and then notice that the United States is very high in the ordering. Canada is also very decentralized. We know Switzerland too, so there are no surprises here. But what's also very interesting is to put together the information about expenditures. And notice that some countries that claim themselves to be very decentralized, really, the only thing they do is that they delegate to the subnational governments some of their expenditures, but they keep the control of the revenues and the control of many of the activities, right? So one thing of the US is, notice, it's the most balanced one. So really, the states and the localities have whatever they control in revenues is what they spend, more or less. Okay, so that for us seems to be a real degree of decentralization. A country like Denmark, which shows to be very decentralized in expenditures, really has little control relatively on the revenues. Okay, there is a lot to talk about in here, but I don't have time. Just facts. So the reliance on by national governments on transfers from the central government, that's another measure of measuring this control versus being dependent on the central government. Well, again, now, the opposite. The United States is very low. Notice that Canada and Switzerland are here too. Germany, you may be surprised by Germany. I don't have time to talk about that, but Germany, I'm sure that we have several Germans here. It's a very special case where it seems like they're very under control, the Länder, but in the end, there is a lot of central decisions. All right, so maybe if someone can talk about this later on from their perspective, will be good. But this is what we get. Spain, it's supposed to be very decentralized. Well, 40%, and this is also measured in a way that's not very precise, but it's from the central government. So the control, notice again, Netherlands here, which these northern countries or Central Europe countries that may seem to be very decentralized but have little control on their. So the final cross-country comparison is this is a coefficient of variation of the size of the state and local government sector, and we interpret this as a high coefficient of variation means that there is diversity across, and in that way we measure it, we think there is more autonomy in the decisions, and we see that again the United States comes out here as very high, Australia also, and then we go down, Germany, Spain, Sweden, Canada. Canada actually was a little bit of a surprise, but there is a lot of equalization. So even though they have a lot of decision power, then there is a system of equalization over the country that reduces this diversity. Okay. How am I in time? Because 10 minutes? Okay. So I have to decide how I jump on things. Okay. So US, relatively small government size, greater degree of fiscal decentralization, less reliance by subnational governments on transfers from the central government, and greater differences across regions, so the diversity is larger. So what we do next, and in here I'm going to jump fast, is that we focus on some characteristics of the US to show this diversity in a better way and to differentiate where is the diversity and where is not. So we analyze intergovernmental fiscal relations, expenditures, and revenues, and I'm going to show you a few statistics and some graphs, and then I'll stop. So essentially what we do here is for different variables that we believe are interesting for understanding the decentralization process. What we do is look at the US average, standard deviation, the coefficient of variation, which is kind of the measure we look across to see how diverse each of these characteristics are. And then, just for your information, the mean and the max, sometimes there are huge differences in mean and max values. So we see that and then we also give the names of the states. So you see that really we can see huge difference, for example, state and local transfers as a percentage of local revenues. One state, Hawaii, is 8%, Vermont, 63%. So huge differences. Okay. What we show here, degree of decentralization from state to local, size of state government, which is about 8%, and size of local government, notice, is about the same, 8.5, 9%, so the same kind of size. There is large diversity at state level than at local level, okay? I already talked about that. So this is about expenditures. Notice that it's quite interesting that, for example, state and local expenditures on K-12, K-12 is education before university, is the variable with less diversity. So even though states have a lot of power to decide, and local communities, actually in the states, the school districts, have a lot of decisions to make, but this is where there is also a lot of equalization, because then there are policies at the state level and some at the national level, because this is one of the public services that they consider is a minimum requirement for giving opportunities to people to succeed in life. So in there, they do have some policy to equalize. Okay, so higher education and university and public welfare, we see that in these variables, the diversity is much smaller than on the next variables. I'm sorry, I still don't have the next variables, because here, yeah, actually on the next variable. So let me maybe show you this, and then I'll go back for a second. So what do we have here? Revenues. And here you see individual income tax, large coefficient of variation. You'll see the graph in a minute. There are huge differences. Some states rely very much on income tax. Some states have zero income tax. General sales tax, the same thing. We see large diversity. States do whatever they think it's better for them. Property tax, this is a local, and it's very important for raising money for the local governments. It's large. Notice the averages. This is huge. This is 13%, 13%. So income and sales tax are about 13% of the revenues. Notice about the property tax in state and local are almost 30%. 5, 3, 0? I don't see. 5? Oh yeah, plenty. Don't worry. I'll be on time. All right. So, so comparing with expenditures, we see much higher diversity across. All right. Now let me go back for a second, just so you see it graphically. This is revenues. And you see that diversity that shows in the coefficient of variation. Here you can see it. Some states have almost 30% of their revenues on income tax. Some states do not rely on income tax at all. On the general sales tax, the same thing. Okay, some states are even above 30%. Some states are 5 or 10 or whatever, and some states have no sales tax. So diversity in revenues is one of the characteristics. They control that, and they do whatever they think. I mean, there's some general restrictions, but in general, they really do have autonomy in deciding, so decision power on their revenues. I'm going to skip this. This is just showing that the school system is also very diverse. Some states favor charter schools, other states don't. I mean, there are huge diversity across. And the last question we make ourselves is, has this diversity been stable over time? And then what we do is we analyze the evolution over time of all those variables I show you about the structure of the decentralization, revenues and expenditures. And we take information from the 1977 to 2011, and we do a very simple thing, which is just look at the coefficient of variation and estimate a simple trend to see if there is any variation over time. And actually, what we find is that there is no significance in some of the variables. There is some positive trend in some of the variables, so we would talk about divergence, and some negative trends in some variables. So we would talk about convergence, and really the only one that is of significance in value is the public welfare, which is, it has been converging because the public welfare in this period has increased its role, and it's the one activity that is more equalizing. All right, so essentially that's it. And concluding remarks, it seems like the US fiscal federal system has its own model, and it has been strong and robust over the years, quite a few years we have analyzed. And what we see in Europe is quite different. It seems like in Europe, the countries are kind of afraid to give this power to the regions. And maybe they should observe what's going on in the US and maybe learn from that and not be afraid to give some autonomy when there are systems afterwards to be able to give transfers or equalize, but allow the regions to do their own way. So maybe that would avoid some problems. Of course, for the regions, we may talk about the European Union, and then we could also think about the European Union as being some kind of a potential federal big state. That will be for maybe the next Jamboree in 10 years when we see how the European Union evolves. Okay, so thank you.